we talked last week on the show about abortion a bit, Suris, and unfortunately, it seems the worst has come to pass. Texas has made a law come into effect on September 1st, saying that abortions are basically illegal after 6 weeks term of pregnancy. And
there's a technicality on
there's
that.
Technicality on that, but that's kind of the short of it, right?
So yes, it's after 6 weeks, but really, realistically, it's after 4 weeks, and it's because if you are to go in and get an abortion now,
Right.
Ignoring all the other the bounty hunter stuff that is wrapped up in that now, there's a 2-week period where they force you to you have to listen to the sonogram, and you have to look at all of these pictures of the fetus, and you have to go through, basically they make you go through emotional turmoil to try to guilt you into keeping it, and there's a 2-week process for that. So the majority of pregnancies are discovered between week 4 and week 7, which means not only is the 6-week ban already taking into account that a good majority of people are in that 7th week and they discovered it and they're already outside of the legal area. The majority of people in general, vast majority, are not going to be able to even legally get these, because if you discover that you're pregnant in week 5, so you just missed your period and you went, oh, I'm going to go get a pregnancy test because that felt kind of weird. Right. Then yeah, you're screwed. Now there's a whole bunch of other issues wrapped up in that, and I did a video on this recently, so I could go on and on.
By recently, you mean literally today is when you put it on your channel. But yeah, it's awful. And the reason why I want to talk about this again, I mean, just like last week, is this is one of those issues where it's not like, with environmental issues, right? There's always competing interests in these fields, but it's somehow tied to money and a lot of the stuff. This is an issue to me, sirs, where it seems like this is pure ideology fighting in this country, right?
It is. And actually the argument that's being used, the cutoff date that's being utilized, is an area of pure emotion. I went into this in my my video, but the idea that we put any special significance on the heart, the reason that it's a 6 week cutoff is that is when cardiac activity is generally in a very small sense being recorded. Now, it's why a lot of these bills are called heartbeat bills. The only reason we put any significance on the heart is because it is fully arbitrary. For all intents and purposes, all of your emotions come from your brain. Your personality comes from your brain. Your feelings, they come from your brain. By basing this based on when your heart is developed enough to beat with a pulse, it is purely emotional, because when you boil it down, it is arbitrary. It's like if I said, hey, when the lungs are formed for the first time, that's going to be our cutoff point. Or, hey, when your left pinky finger has been formed for the first time, that's our cutoff point. Right. Or I could name any vital organ for this and just use that. Hey, your liver has been formed. This is the moment where we deem you to be a human. And now all people who have their liver removed are no longer human. It's literally just that the heart has had cultural significance for humans for such a long time before we understood that your brainwaves are literally what make you be and feel. And yet that's where we're denoting the cutoff.
Right. And there's obviously a lot of misinformation that surrounds this issue. A lot of people bring up the fact that a lot of products Coke products are actually made with aborted fetal tissue and stuff like that. A lot of
cool,
that kind of
and drinking
stuff.
Babies.
Yeah, drinking babies, right? A nice refreshing glass of babies. Now, I guess that would fall into the atheist mythos there of consuming children, but obviously all that stuff's not true, right? And on top of that, there is just this idea of once the at conception the soul is kind of formed, and there's this kind of kooky idea of what even a soul is, or even when they conflate zygotes with babies. There's all kinds of misinformation out there, and a big part of it is because of, again, what you point out, these emotional arguments, and a lot of it is coming from ideology specifically. I mean, a lot of these conservative Christian movements that have been gunning for laws like this to happen all the time, like pretty much ever since we've been alive, right? And it's really, really frustrating that we're seeing this happen now of all times. And I'm just really, really worried. I'm worried about the 14-year-old girl that has to carry their pregnancy to term because they don't have the options. You know, like Texas.
Technically, there's an issue with that one too. Because in Texas now, the way the bill is worded, if it comes to a point of, am I allowed to say the R word, or should I? Everybody understands what non-consensual assault means.
Sure. Yeah.
So in a case of non-consensual assault, or in a case of incest, in Texas, if you actually do say that, hey, I want to get an abortion because of these reasons, they literally have this entire process now where you have to sit down and explain beat for beat what happened. And then one of the questions that is in your, we'll delightfully call it an interview, is why didn't you stop it? And I'm just going to go ahead and say right now, the question, why didn't you stop it? It probably doesn't need to be asked in a situation where I didn't consent to it is part of the conversation. If I didn't consent to it, you can fill in your blank on the answer of why didn't I stop it. It's probably going to be some form of I was powerless to and therefore, or I was threatened to and therefore. This is it feels like a setup that's there that intuitively, when you hear it the first time, you're like, okay, yeah, prove that this happened and I understand that. But the way that it's functionally going to operate feels a lot like shaming the victims into reliving all of this. And by having the stipulations that, okay, in a case of incest, in a case of forced assault, they can be more they can have more leeway on the law where that's concerned. With that being the way that things are being structured, this leads me to another problem, which is now you have there's been a narrative that conservatives have pushed a lot, especially in evangelical circles, especially in places like the Catholic Church, that forced assault is not as much of a problem as several what was the way that it's usually worded, like the way that young women on college campuses try to tell you it is. That's not how it is. It doesn't happen all that often. That's what we hear. My fear is that incentivizing not necessarily incentivizing, but almost incentivizing you to argue that you were assaulted so that you can get, in many cases, what would be a medically necessary procedure for yourself. It incentivizes you in some cases to lie and throw somebody under the bus for the sake of self-preservation. And then that would end up creating a feedback loop into the narrative of, oh, well, look at all these women who've lied about it.
Right.
You've backed them into a corner where they felt that they've had to. And yeah, it's horrible to lie about that and ruin somebody's life. That is one of the worst things you can do to a person, is, you know, throw them under the bus and ruin their entire existence. But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy when it's engineered this way. Right. And I don't know if that, I can't get in the minds of any particular lawmakers' heads. I don't have that ability. My fear, though, is that may have been considered at some point.
So, man, okay, I never even thought about it from that angle, but yeah, so like this law is also serving like multiple purposes, in the sense that it's also fueling like these weird narratives about women and like this stereotype that women lie about their experiences. Like, that's so terrible. There's more things to consider about how terrible this whole thing is. The point I wanted to make about too was, for people who don't live in the United States, who understand how big of a deal this is to even just try to get this happen. Because some people might say, well, can't you just go somewhere else outside of the state? If you're driving from Austin and you're trying to get to Louisiana, right? So Austin, you know, it's kind of central Texas. It takes like 7 hours just to get out of the state. Like, Texas is huge. Okay?
Texas is larger than most countries.
Right.
And topple onto that, there's a couple of issues that get layered onto that. One, now the only people who potentially would be able to get an abortion if they needed one would be people who have the money to actually go on a trip like that. Not everybody has the wherewithal to. Only it wasn't until very recently, as in like a couple of months ago, that I had a vehicle that could travel more than 10 minutes in any one direction without causing me severe issues. Now, it's and it's not just the money issue. There's layers and layers and layers that get wrapped into this. If memory serves, when it comes to places like when it comes to the outskirts of Texas, there's not really that many abortion clinics.
Well, I was going to say too, because like Louisiana should not be your safe haven to go to for an abortion either, right?
No,
like
Resident Evil 7 happened there.
Yeah, well, there's that too, but also just like, it's not like that they're going to feel too politically, different on these issues, right? So I have a feeling Louisiana is probably going to be next in line. I know that I've read at least reports about Florida and other places like considering these kinds of laws for their own states.
Well, I know Florida and Georgia have been they've been pushing for this for a while. Yeah. Georgia actually had a heartbeat bill for just a little while, and then the ACLU popped in and was like, hey, maybe not, maybe don't.
Yeah. So anyway, like I posted about this on Twitter this week because I get asked sometimes about like why talk about issues like this, right? Like why bother other people about issues like religion? Because it seems some people say, well, it should be this personal thing. You shouldn't actually talk to people about it. But like religion is absolutely informing this issue right now.
Correct.
And like we have to fight back. It's not an instance of we are shoving this down people's throats. They are literally making their ideology into law in this country. And we have to follow that, whether we like it or not, whether we believe in the same kinds of things that they do or not. So it's really, I don't know if this is going to have people, be open to this more and realize where all this is coming from now that like it's getting really serious. But unfortunately, like I said, this has been going on. Like attempts of this have been happening for decades, and now it's finally happening.
And there are some people who I will not name because this is not the time nor the place that think that this is a right that's been stripped away from people because they've committed some horrible thing, like they've given up some fundamental right elsewhere, so now they have to give up this right. No, this is a battle that's been being fought for ages. The whole reason we even had the conversation with Roe v. Wade, which at the end of the day is mostly a privacy issue, which kind of feeds into some of the problems with this current iteration of the bill. The whole reason we've even had that conversation is that this has been an ongoing battle and it has not stopped. And I think this particular thing exemplifies the fact that in America, or really anywhere, once you've earned your civil rights, they are still not guarantees. They will never and never and cannot be guarantees.
It's so true.
So long as there are people who are ideologically opposed to you having those ideals. But speaking of ideology, I just want to throw out a hypothetical. I used this is an argument that I made in an older video of mine, and I'll repeat it here for fun. You mentioned earlier the idea that a soul, enters the body upon conception, and therefore all of these lives are important in the face of God. That's a very ideological, religiously motivated way to look at this. Well, there's another ideological, religiously motivated argument that is made a lot in terms of Christian apologia to try to argue that the Christian God is not some kind of moral monster, and it's something called the age of accountability. The age of accountability can also be known as, the age of sufficient knowledge. This is the moment where a child can be held accountable enough to have chosen whether or not to, be a child of God, basically, where they can choose to accept Jesus into their heart when they have a sufficient amount of time, sufficient amount of knowledge, where Romans 1 can argue that, you had it written on your heart, you could have done something about this. If you are a Christian who is against abortion, I have a proposition for you. It is not just a pro-choice argument. It is a abortion mandate, almost. If your goal is to get more souls into heaven, and you agree with the age of accountability, then all fetuses that are aborted go to heaven. Every single one. It is functionally identical to saving that soul.
Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it? Because I this was a thing too about, I remember hearing this growing up, asking like what happens to kids who die too young to really understand and things like that. And of course, depending on your denomination, there's different ideas about how salvation works. Some of it is just pure baptism. Some of it's through, other means. Although there are verses that say you can baptize your whole family and they don't even necessarily have to be believers, and they
don't
still
have
be
to
saved.
consent; it just happens.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure.
I know that's a big thing in Mormonism too. Like they baptize the dead.
They baptize the dead, and I believe there's a verse that Paul says somewhere in one of his letters that enforces that. But anyway, yeah, there's all kinds of weird ideas about how people are even saved, and nobody even has an agreed upon thing. But yeah, I guess that if you're a person who believes in that theology, I guess that makes sense, huh?
And it's because when I was a kid, I was taught the age of accountability. That was because it was taught to me that no, if a kid doesn't understand or somebody doesn't know, like they don't have sufficient knowledge, so of course, you know, God's not going to be a monster. He's not evil. He's not going to send you to go burn in a fiery lake because you just simply didn't know. You never had an opportunity to know, so you don't have sufficient knowledge. Okay, cool. Then we've hit this awkward point where the reductio ad absurdum of your position is just Yeetus the fetus 100% of the time.
Jesus Christ. Oh my God. Oh wow, we've got a lot of we've got jiggle physics on this show, and we've got Yeetus the fetus. This is freaking me out a little bit. I'm not gonna lie, this is a weird one. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. That seems to be logically sound if you're following from those premises.
And it's weird. It's like you have to either reject the age of accountability, which makes God a moral monster, or you have to accept this other very, very heinous proposition. Like, take your pick. They're both bad.
It's almost as if Christianity doesn't make any sense, huh?
There are many aspects of it that I believe do not. This is one of them.
I would think I would be inclined to agree with you on that, sir.